these Supreme Court cases that has been taken up by the courts, the highest court, the land's highest court. And interestingly enough, some of the arguments being made and the questions being asked by some of the DEI hired justices make it a really interesting case. If you're not familiar with this, I'll set up the case briefly. There was a law in Colorado called the Minor Conversion Therapy Law. It was passed in 2019. And effectively what it said, and again, there's a lot of nuance to it, but just effectively what it said is that in therapy, a patient, or a child in this case, a child patient could not be talked out of being transgender or changing their gender by the therapist. In other words, if a 12-year-old kid sits down in a therapist's office and says, I think I'm the opposite gender, by law, the therapist is not allowed to say, no, you're not. And even softer than that, maybe they're not even allowed to say, well, can we think about that a little bit? What do we, maybe let's unpack that before we dive so headfirst into something that, everybody knows is going to make your life substantially more difficult. You are not allowed to push back at all because the Colorado legislature called that quote unquote conversion therapy. Also, in the text of the law, it bans a bunch of stuff that wasn't happening and then includes therapy in that. It says something along the lines of, you can't do shock therapy to try and get the kid to stop being a transgender. We're banning shock therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, which again, if you combine that with shock therapy, shock therapy is insane. That is crazy. And cognitive behavior therapy is a normal thing that a lot of people who go to therapists do. And if in the process of cognitive behavioral therapy, the therapist says, hey, maybe you're not the opposite sex, that's illegal in Colorado as of 2019. Well, of course, that came to the Supreme Court because therapy is speech. It is a conversation between two individuals, unless it's group therapy. But in most cases, a patient and a therapist, it's clearly protected under free speech. This seems to be a no-brainer. At least you would think so. Until the oral arguments happened earlier this week. We all are familiar with the DEI hire Ketanji Brown Jackson. Remember when Joe Biden said, I'm going to pick a black woman, which was on its face discriminatory and probably against the law. But he did. He picked Ketanji, and she's been known to ask some very, very stupid questions. We've got some audio here, and I want to play about a minute and a half of it, but I'll probably jump in and kind of explain or reiterate what she's trying to say and help everybody continue to understand that I think Ketanji Brown Jackson is not very smart. This is an ongoing theme here, and I think this is going to continue. Smart or evil, cynical or evil, or lying or evil, or just dumb. Those are the options for people on the lib side of the aisle. And again, remains to be an open case for one of the Supreme Court justices. Let's go ahead and play cut 8, and I'll jump in where it feels appropriate.
As I understand it, the First Amendment protects the communication of messages, expression, etc. Am I right about that? I mean, you're communicating, and that's what the First Amendment is about.
Correct.
Just struggling with whether a therapist who is acting in their professional capacity to help someone achieve their goals is really expressing the kind of message or expressing a message for First Amendment purposes. I mean, I understand if Ms. Childs here were writing an article about conversion therapy or writing or giving a speech about it. But it's just a little puzzling to me that she would stand in a different position than a medical professional who has exactly the same goals, exactly the same interests, and would just be prescribing medication for that rather than.
Okay, so we're going to jump in here because the first part of that, right, I can give some grace for Supreme Court justices who are asking ridiculous questions in order to build a case and get to an ultimate point. That kind of happens all the time. So Ketanji Brown Jackson says, let me get this straight. So a conversation that is protected under free speech, under the First Amendment, correct? Yes. And okay, maybe she's building her case, but as we're seeing right now, the case that she's making isn't anywhere near what she would have, quote unquote, been building towards. It seems that the first question that she asked was possibly even a genuine curiosity of, hey, is a conversation between two individuals actually that's free speech, right? And the attorney goes, correct. Yes, it is, Ketanji, thank you. But then she tries to make this case in which she says, well, since a therapist is giving therapy, and that's in some ways, a medical science, is there any difference between that and a doctor prescribing medication? Because a doctor prescribing medication, let's say he's writing a script out to go to the pharmacy to get whatever medication, well, that's not free speech because that's licensed and that's regulated by a bunch of different regulatory agencies. So technically, the doctor doesn't have free speech to write whatever prescription he wants because it has to be within his professional capacity. No. Therapy is not like that. Therapy, if you don't know this, and maybe it's because I'm married to a therapist, is not an exact science. Now, I understand some people might argue, well, medicine isn't an exact science either. Yeah, but there's quite a bit more that we know about medicine than we do of the human mind. In case you're new to the way that people think and I guess philosophy more broadly, we've been trying to figure out how the human mind works since the dawn of time. And some progress has been made, but not a whole heck of a lot. So the argument to say that, well, okay, a therapist and their client is basically the same as a doctor and the patient if the doctor's prescribing meds. No, it's not. And while I guess I can understand somebody making that argument, it's astonishing to me that it's coming out of a Supreme Court justice. Let's continue on here. I think the attorney gives some responses as well.
And her talking with the client.
I think that they would have exactly the same goals. Because this involves a conversation.
Yes.
There is a back and forth. So this court has recognized many times in cases like McCullen that a one-on-one conversation is a form of speech. And that's exactly what's going on with Ms. Childs and her clients. So when she engages in those conversations, she's encouraging them to achieve their goals. She's discussing concepts of identity and behavior and attractions and how they fit together. This is an ongoing active dialogue where she's helping them to explore their goals, and that absolutely has to be protected by the First Amendment.
That's about it. That's the only necessary part there. But the main point is that Ketanji Brown Jackson, one, asked a question which you might think, okay, she's building up to something, and then gives us that. Okay, is it and the attorney too, I'm not sure that guy's name, I probably should have pulled that, masterfully, and without belittling her too much, because I probably would have been pretty snarky there. As a guy who almost considered going to law school, I do consider myself to be the legal expert on this show. Between me, myself, and I, as a guy who considered going to law school, it would be very difficult in that situation to not be super snarky to a Supreme Court justice. But the attorney then says, "Yeah, well, it's speech. We're not talking about medication that can alter the biology. Maybe that's it. Maybe Ketanji Brown Jackson again famously said she's not a biologist, so maybe she doesn't quite understand how medicine works. That's possible." But the attorney's saying, no, this is a conversation. Conversations are protected by free speech. In the context of therapy or in the context of you discussing life at the barbershop or at a coffee shop or wherever it is that you might be discussing, it's all conversation. So yeah, it's protected by free speech. This is one of those where it should be a slam dunk. It should be 9-0, I think the Supreme Court should rule. Of course, a therapist has the right, but in my opinion, the obligation to try and talk a kid out of trying to appear as a different gender. But this is one of those where if one or two of the justices peels off, we could win the case, but it could mean something way worse for the idea of the spirit of the free speech First Amendment. This could be really interesting going forward.